What should you do with the 101 in rookie drafts? If you hold the 101 in your Dynasty League now, should you hold it? Should you keep it? What should you do? That's what me and Shawn are going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. We're also going to answer a couple of listener questions. We're going to look through some rosters that they have also submitted. Lots of different things to talk through. And what would we do if it was our Dynasty roster? Shawn, how are you feeling as we get into Combine week? A couple of days away, we'll get the testing results, and obviously it will change with some of the incoming data and information that people have in terms of the perception of some of these players. But how are you feeling as we get ready for the NFL Combine?
Well, this class is interesting but there are questions about how strong his fantasy fit is. And that's on top of the questions that always exist when it comes down to making the jump, being a viable NFL starting quarterback. We've seen plenty of supposedly top prospects miss. Now, one of the things that we have found is that if you use Travis May's scheme-adjusted numbers, then you at least have a shortcut to being slightly more accurate, or you at least have the ability to look at these players on relatively even terms and see what they've done in the past. And that is meaningful, even though plenty of other things like arm strength, intangibles that wouldn't have shown up at the college level because the player is young or the team situation is bad. The team situation is good or bad in dramatically different ways at the NFL level. All of those types of things. And the QB projection is tough, and a huge percentage of these players are busts. But that's one of the things that makes it so fun to work through some of the Sports Info Solution numbers and see what's there, see what's under the hood. Sometimes it is surprising. We have those numbers for you in the RotoViz Rookie Guide that is out now. Also includes a big discount for the RotoViz 1-year subscription. You'll love having both of those pieces. Colm, when we have a QB in the mix for Superflex, that's always a big deal because the QB is going to be in competition for the 101. We also know, or anybody who has been playing some early best ball, that this class has a lot of running backs, but they also have an elite running back. The little bit of, I don't know, fly in the ointment exactly, but with Ashton G, you have this question about his competition. I don't think there's any question that he's going to be good. The question is he merely a well above average starter, someone who could end up being a Josh Jacobs-like player, or is he Bijan Robinson? Is he Saquon Barkley? Is he that type of guy? Because if he is, then he's going to be separated enough that 101 is something that you need to get quite a bit for in order to move. If that top running back tier that goes 5 or 6 deep is actually all one pack, then moving back becomes interesting. So I think that you have to look to move back, especially because there is a star wide receiver in this draft, even though the receiver position overall is not particularly strong. There is possibly a star tight end, even though that's a little bit controversial, in that you could probably make a case for 3 different guys to be the top tight end, and yet where they are projected to go and how early they will be productive, or the odds that you get the truly massive season, right? Which is what we're looking for. We're looking for that Kyle Pitts rookie season, that Sam Laporta rookie season. I mean, you're not going to get a Brock Bowers rookie season, but you could get maybe 75% of that with more touchdowns. And then the
one thing that I do think is interesting for the tight end, so we can't fully tell yet, but with the rookie wide receivers, or with the rookie quarterbacks, it was always you go back 15 years, it was kind of set them for a couple of years every time. With the tight ends, there was sometimes where they'd be brought along slowly. But you mentioned Pitts, then we had Laporta, now we had Bowers. I think teams might be willing to give them 100 targets, coming into the league versus, a couple of years ago. I think that was only the elite of the elite that were getting opportunities like that.
And I think that mostly what we've gotten is that it is the elite guys who are getting that. But the evolution at the college level, the evolution at the pro level, the changes in positions reflects a change potentially in tactics. We know that the Detroit Lions were criticized for using early picks on Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta, and ever since they made those moves, they've been an unstoppable juggernaut on offense. If you can add one of these tight ends, and certainly there are some guys who look like they could be the Sam Laporta type. There's also a riskier player who looks like he could be the Evan Ingram or Jordan Reed type, maybe a little closer to that Kyle Pitts. I mean, those guys are likely to score well as rookies if they land in the right spot. So you work through all of that, and one of the things that jumps out to you is that you have options. And so if you move down from the 101, you still have an excellent chance to get a good player. You even think of last season, where if you move down all the way to the end of the round, then you're starting to look at guys like Xavier Worthy and Brian Thomas and Bo Nix. And all three of those players right now are hugely valuable, probably more valuable than the player who was drafted 101 in Caleb Williams. So there's a value in simply exercising humility as you move through these drafts. Certainly there's the value of getting multiple picks, multiple players, but you don't want to just move down. You do need to get pieces for them. And I think that 101, especially when you're talking about a player who could put up one of those 350, 400 point running back seasons, to move off of him, you need to get multiple first round picks, whether that's getting the 103 and a 2026 first rounder that might be late, whether it's getting the 105 and the 106. Because you have some decent depth in the middle of this draft, some of those things may be difficult. I think the fact that we've gotten some good hits as you move through drafts recently, that some managers are going to simply say, I want to hold. The reason I acquired multiple first round picks in the first place is that I value having volume, having optionality, and or I'm just in a position with my team where I need more than one guy. At the same time, you have to be willing to make creative offers, to push in different ways, to see what you can break free. It may be the 107, a very valuable current veteran who rounds out your position player group in one area or another, and a 2026 pick of some type of value in order to get yourself off of this pick for a player where, and you even think of someone like Bijan Robinson, who didn't hit to quite the extent we were hoping as a rookie, certainly didn't have a Saquon Barkley rookie type of year, and then comes out in year two and is overshadowed by Barkley, an older version of Barkley. He's arguably overshadowed by a Jahmyr Gibbs, and yet what he's done over those first two seasons, I had several dynasty teams this last year where either had the 101 last year or was in a startup and had a bad startup pick. And so Robinson, even as a rookie, when you have the 112 or you move down into the early 2 range, he's the guy. You make those moves, you're a little bit disappointed with them originally, but then they're a key piece of winning the title last year. Both of those teams did win championships. If you're not actually getting value for it, then go ahead and hold, make the pick. I would also note, just as a tiny little caveat, that if you simply have other players rated higher, maybe select those guys or take very little to move down. That was the dilemma that Blair and I faced. The only share that I have of Caleb Williams is one where Blair and I had won the back draw. We had the 101. We really wanted Jaden Daniels or to move all the way down and take Brock Bowers, but we couldn't get the right value for it. And you're thinking, well, I mean, Caleb Williams' profile is good. And that's something I would emphasize as we look to his second season in putting together this year's version of the rookie guide. You are comparing and contrasting. You're thinking through all the numbers from past players. It reinforced again that what the Bears did to Caleb Williams this first season or this past season, man, I mean, he bears some responsibility, but that was rough. Long
So we're
story
waiting
short, we did
for
end up taking Caleb Williams, even though Jaden Daniels was the guy we basically had rated higher and the person we really wanted. It now looks like that decision. I mean, Colm, the teams that drafted Jaden Daniels, we won with, right? Blair and I finished third in the playoffs. The difference between Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams, basically the difference between winning a title and being set over the next decade for 4 or 5 more titles, to where now you're back and you're thinking, well, how can we build out enough depth to compete with the team that does have Jaden Daniels?
Yeah, so
if you have a guy rated higher, go ahead and get that guy.
So we're waiting for basically the Bryce Young experience here to kick in after the dreadful rookie season, and see what happens as we move forward. What I think a lot of people will be interested in as well, if you are moving back. So at the moment, we're waiting for the combine. There's going to be information this week. Maybe that rockets Genty's stock higher. Maybe it impacts it negatively. We have a number of players that can happen to, and the value of that pick, or the way that they will be drafted, may become even more clearer. Obviously, if an offer comes in now that is too good to refuse, you move back. Like you're saying, if there's a player that you're happy, if you get offered the 103 and something else to move back, and you're happy with the options of the top 3 players and who you may get at that particular point, then go ahead and do it. But how do you feel on when you should be trying to maximize, whether it's the 101 or any of the other high value picks? Is it a case to move it when the offer comes in, or should you be waiting to see when you are closer to the draft or even on the clock? Because at this particular point, we are now in and around 2 months away from the actual NFL draft happening. Most of the drafts then will be the following week or in the weeks preceding that. When is the best time, do you think, in your opinion, to move that pick? Is it more beneficial to hold on to people are really chomping at the bit to get it, or should you just try and move it at this particular point?
I think you want to move it as soon as you get a value that is clearly more than what it's worth. And that could come at any time during prospect season. The other managers who desperately want that player are going to feel the pressure of the clock as you get closer and closer to the day, and then as you get on the clock. But the pressure also affects the seller, in that you start to run out of time to make that move. Now, you can always make the selection and then make the trade, but there's a psychological element to, once you have someone on your roster, it can be harder to move them. Once an opposing manager has missed on all of their best trade offers and has been snubbed, there can be a psychological element where they've made their peace with it, or they're angry about it and are no longer to pay the same price. So I think that you have to be a little bit aware.
The other part, Shawn, is the way the draft plays out. Maybe the player that you pick isn't the player that they wanted with that pick. Obviously, the 101 makes that a little bit clearer, but if you're the 103, 104, the way the draft plays out at quarterback or wide receiver, however it'll be, they may decide, I didn't want that player, or maybe they get their player even at that later pick.
Certainly. So if someone's looking to move up one pick and you're trying to really extort them, you have to be aware of the fact that you may not even take the guy that they want, and they're going to have that awareness as well. If there are 2 players with virtual identical ADPs in that rookie draft, and you have the first selection, and the person behind you has either very different ratings, or positionally they're under a lot of pressure to take one guy, then sometimes they're going to be willing to pay a pretty decent amount to move up, even if the overall ratings from the general community are the same. But as you're trying to pressure them because you think that is the case, you have to be aware that sometimes they're wrong. In my leagues, I tend to not let positional pressure ever dictate the picks. And so there will be plenty of situations where managers ahead of me will make moves that they think then will allow them to extort a bigger price in trade, when the reality is actually the opposite, that I'm hoping they will let the better player slide through to me. You got to work through all of those different permutations. And we go back to sort of our very foundational premise, which is that trades should be win-win for you and your trade partner. They're going to be losses for the other 10 managers in your league. And so working to something that is fair and that helps both parties is the way to make the most total trades. We look back again at this 101, whether you should buy it, whether you should sell it, how much you should sell for. One of the things, as you mentioned, you have to be aware, if you get good offers this week, you might want to take those. There's a possibility that the combine elevates 3 or 4 players to the point where the tier breaks are different. Maybe if you're getting an offer for someone who has the 106, in part because they think the draft, if someone's offering you the 106 plus and it's actually a very good deal and you'd be considering taking it, part of what's going through their mind there is that A, they think the 101 is gapped and is going to be a generational type of player. B, they think that the draft is 5 players deep. You put those two things together, they're maybe willing to make you a very good offer. But then the combine changes things, so now the draft is 6 players deep. You actually lose your leverage even as you move deeper into the season. You don't know what's going to happen, right? So you can't necessarily make those moves based on anticipating the future. But you have to be aware that if you're already getting a good deal, in many cases, there are diminishing returns to holding out for just a slightly better deal. Just go ahead and take the offer.
That question did come in from Dynasty FF777. They also shared, Shawn, their roster. They were talking about, what should they sell it for, or should they hold it? They have the 101, the 207. They have their 26th, first and second, and they have 2027 first and second. So pick-wise, they have some high capital there. It's a 10-team Dynasty League, tight end premium, and half-point PPR. 1 point for tight ends. It's Superflex, 6 points for pass and touchdown. Shawn, this team is pretty loaded when we look into it. It's a deeper roster. You're allowed 35 players on the roster, but Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray. When you do get into even 2 teams less than the 12-team leagues, you can add some firepower, but really stacked at QB. Jameer Gibbs, Kenneth Walker, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson, Jordan Mason as the picks of the running backs, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore, Brandon Ayuk as the wide receivers at the high end, and then Trey McBride. I'll say Ben Simmons, Shawn, but Trey McBride is the option there at tight end that I would highlight. But really, really strong roster with the 101. I think I would be looking potentially with the perpetual reloading side of things to be moving on from Terry McLaurin and DJ Moore if possible. Brandon Ayuk coming back off the injury could be challenging to move him this offseason. But I do think that in terms of high-end, high-caliber players that you want to have in your roster, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Gibbs, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Trey McBride, this manager is set up pretty well with that 101 to go along with it.
Yeah, the starting lineup here is fantastic. Maybe the depth is a little bit weaker. And so, the RB2 position, especially if Walker and the Seahawks end up disappointing and or Walker ends up in a full-blown committee, then maybe that's not a great RB2. The 101 is perfect for giving yourself another Gibbs level running back and having this, virtually unbeatable starting lineup. But the other thing you certainly can do with it, move the 101 for like the 106. You're still going to probably add a strong running back there. The 106 and another starting wide receiver would be an interesting play to give you the depth. You mentioned moving off of Terry McLaurin and DJ Moore. You could do that, or you could kind of wait for these 2026 and 2027 drafts where you're loaded with picks to build the depth. Both McLaurin and Moore are guys who look like they'll score well for you this year. But I agree with everything that you said there. This team looks like it's very well set up, and it's really the depth at running back, wide receiver, and tight end where you might look. And it's not that the depth is poor, but just, man, we every season do see individual teams that are just eviscerated by injury.
The next question comes in from Josh Miller, and I enjoyed getting this one. Josh mentions in the email that he had sent over some questions last year, relatively new Dynasty manager, and that it helped him quite a bit. He did just miss out in the playoffs, but he's looking for some advice. Shawn, we must have done pretty okay. He's come back a second time. So he mentioned, I wrote last year and give you some feedback, or we give some feedback on his team, and as a new Dynasty player wanting to learn and build on the RotoViz approach of perpetually reloading in the permanent championship window. He was wondering if we could give him some feedback as he continues to implement these principles. Hopefully, it would be helpful to others to hear as they consider their rosters too. So it's a 12-team PPR, 3 wide receiver, 2 flex, super flex, non-tight end premium, 22 roster spots with 3 taxi squad spots for rookies. Roster is Herbert, Nix, Daniel Jones, Achan, Bucky Irving, Travis Etienne, Tyrone Tracy, Jaylen Waddle, Tyjae Spears, McLaughlin, and Kendra Miller. Then a tight end, it's Sam Laporta and Sinnott. And then we get Waddle, Higgins, Worthy, JSN, Brian Thomas, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, Wan'Dale Robinson, Quentin Johnson at wide receiver. The picks this year, the 106, 104, 106, 112, 204, 211, 303, 304, 2026, no first, 1 second rounder, 3 third rounders, 2027, 1 first, 2 seconds, 1 third. Barely missed the playoffs. His team had by far the most points in the playoff weeks. He was peaking at the right time with a young team. He's trying to manage the young team, the number of picks he has for this year. And he's considering trying to trade Warren, Etienne, and maybe even Tracy with so many quality running backs in this draft. He also has an offer to pick up Jerry Jeudy in exchange for the 204, the 304, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Is wondering if we think that he should accept that offer. And there is some names then. He mentions that he hopes that Franklin, Kendra Miller, Quentin Johnson, Spears, and Warren, things can still pick out there. And then Wan'Dale, if he could get himself a decent quarterback, is such a solid floor option. So Shawn, there's lots to unpack here. It's basically this roster. What would we do? How would we turn it around? And the thing I think that to come in and really factor in is in those opening 2 rounds, he has 5 picks in this year's draft. So there is the ways to move there as well. Team's pretty good shape. Shawn, first we'll kick off with the team. What's your overall thoughts on the roster in general?
Yeah, the squad is fantastic. And you can certainly look at it and say, I mean, this is a team that would have scored the most points in the fantasy playoffs. So you're always that, I mean, you can't help but be frustrated that you barely missed, because if you had made it, you would have won the whole thing. Perfectly set up in so many different ways. You have the QBs, although a third QB certainly would really help. You've got running back depth. You have the tight end star. You've got a ton of receiver depth with high-end firepower, but then players at different scoring levels and a lot of youth. I would go ahead and add Jerry Jeudy. That helps you build out that wide receiver group, give you the depth that you are looking for. And again, as you hit the buys, as you hit injuries, you're going to invariably need. I do think the 204 can end up being a pretty interesting pick. So it's not like this is a trade where you couldn't end up being disappointed later. I think that second round picks in 2025 are going to hit at a pretty good rate with the depth that we have at that running back position, just filling things out, pushing guys down, making that an interesting stanza. So again, it's not like you couldn't be wrong, but picking someone up like a Jerry Jeudy, where I do think their perception is a little different than the reality, even for many managers who are fully aware and believe in what he did last year. The other element there for you as a dynasty manager, because he is younger than the number of years in the league would tend to tell you intuitively. I mean, he feels like a guy who's mid to almost the back half of the middle of his career. That's not really the case. He's someone you can acquire, you can play successfully for a couple of years. As he plays successfully, he solidifies himself as being that, not superstar, but well above average starter and potential foundation piece for your team. And then once he's solidified that, even though he's a couple of years older, because he's still kind of end of the peak window at that point, then you can trade him for more than it costs to acquire him, while you also got his peak seasons. That's really the dream when you're executing the perpetual reloading strategy. So Jeudy is perfect for that. With the QB situation in Cleveland, you do always want to note that it's not completely without risk. You look through the rest of the things that have been done here, and I mean, this team is extremely well set up. This is the second team in a row where you mentioned Sinnott. Colm, it's almost like we missed on him last season. The thing that I think is interesting when we're looking at the running backs on the notes that he has here about trading Warren, ETN, and maybe even Tracy. Tracy is a guy, when you look at best ball ADP and you think about how that reflects back on Dynasty and gives you some insight, that he is probably the player, I wouldn't say overvalued, but because he's entering year 2, because he is a potential 3-down back, because you have that rookie shine from him and what he did over the second half of last season, the enthusiasm for him as opposed to players like ETN and Warren who were coming off of disappointing seasons, I think Tracy is the guy who probably has the least value of that trio, and yet at the same time will get you the most. Now, it's hard to say that because we want Tracy to be good. We would love to keep him on the teams that have him. You do have some interest in just selecting him again this year. I came on at the end of a draft that Blair and Kevin did last week where they had picked him in their best ball stream that they were doing there, and I gave him a little bit of a hard time about it. Wanted to know how they were justifying his price given the likely competition he would have. When you look at that and you think about ETN, someone that I constantly get offers where people are trying to sell me ETN. Now they're trying to sell him to me for more than the market and his 2024 production deserves, but I can understand where they're going with that. I think that ETN is someone that you probably make counter offers on and try to pick up. One of the things that you want to look to do right now is a player like ETN, where his competition is already priced in, his bad season is holding down his price. He becomes pretty interesting because there's at least a possibility that once he's healthy and in an offense on a team that's run like a real NFL team with some youth at the head coaching position, with some dynamism, some innovation on the offensive side of the ball, you get him healthy, and he's the guy who was one of the greatest college running backs ever and is still very, very athletic and brings both the rushing upside and the receiving upside to the table. You look at Jaylen Warren, and you're talking about a guy who over the last 2, 3, 4 years combined has put out the best peripherals as a runner in all of football. Now, we do have some questions about the Steelers, how all of that will work, but I do think that Warren's poor season, the potential, and I mean, you're going to get competition in that backfield. You're going to have another back who's taking some of the work, but you look at where Warren is, and again, that appears to be priced in, which isn't the case with lots of other backs. Anybody that has a resume with some elite type of trait or production, which you have for both ETN and Warren, and when they're discounted based on the last season and the competition is already priced in, you might look to acquire them. Now, the way that running backs age, it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to work, because part of what's holding them down is the last season. And for different reasons, that may or may not be the beginning of the end for both guys. And maybe for ETN, I mean, the end is already here, which would be sad. Again, none of these moves are risk-free, but that's how we would look at those 3 backs in terms of trying to buy them or sell them across all of our Dynasty portfolio and the portfolios that our listeners have.
Yeah, there's always a crossover. We mentioned Sinnott there twice. There will be a crossover with a number of these players based on what we've recommended and who ends up on these rosters. But Shawn, for every Sinnott, I'm sure there's numerous Brock Bowers out there to balance it out. And we're heading into tier 2 with Sinnott. Maybe things pick up a little bit. Maybe he was behind Zach Ertz. Can we get a Trey McBride scenario here? I don't think we will, but fun to joke about. The other thing with players like Jaleel McLaughlin, who's part of that trade offer for Jerry Jeudy, I do think with the running backs coming in, there's potential for some of those. Like I'd be shocked if the Broncos don't draft a running back at some point in this draft, and there's a chance for all those guys to get squeezed out or squeezed a little bit more. So moving on from some of those veteran names that aren't at the top of the roster depth chart, I think could be a good move. As much as I do like Jaleel. Thanks to Josh for sending that question. Hopefully it helps with some of the conversation that we've talked through there. Shawn, 2 quick ones to finish. Athlete Critique messaged in to say, who would you rather have in Dynasty, Waddle or Pickens. Waddle was on that last roster, and he's somebody that I'm very open to kind of moving on from in some of these dynasty leagues. The problem is a bit like you mentioned with ETN, you're kind of moving out at the lowest point of his value. But the trouble with some of these players is when it gets to a point, the value never fully recovers. But I'd be willing to see that hopefully that happens with Waddle moving forward here. But Waddle or Pickens, Shawn, who would you rather have rostered?
We had Pickens as a sell ahead of last season. I think that was perfect timing on him. The buy ahead of 2023, the sell ahead of 2024. I think you might be in a situation where you're back to the buy. I have him at wide receiver 26. I have Waddle at wide receiver 42. From that perspective, not particularly close. I do think that you have moved into the range where you're talking about from wide receiver 25-ish, Josh Downs, to wide receiver 45-ish, say Keon Coleman, Jacoby Myers type of territory. You're talking about players who aren't that dissimilar in value. What you have are different ways in which you might expect that value to manifest, or different risk profiles, where some of the younger guys who haven't done a lot yet, you have a better chance of getting a 0 and having that value move to almost 0 as we work through 2025. But you also have a lot more room for them to jump into a range where they become a true impact player. I think, unfortunately for guys like Cortland Sutton, Mike Evans, Brandon Ayuk, the names who come up just before Jaylen Waddle for me, you're looking at the value declining over the next several seasons. Michael Pittman is also in there. Can they hold a scoring profile for a while that makes them still key contributors to teams that are in the mix? I think that they can. But one of the problems with trying to predict when those falls are going to happen, or someone like an Ayuk who has been inconsistent, who has been involved in the holdouts, who's had injuries, what are you going to get in terms of these guys bouncing back? I think that is kind of the interesting question as you work through players in this type of range. What do you need for your team? What is your risk profile in terms of looking at receivers and rostering them in Dynasty? What types of guys do you like? And do you want to sort of balance a variety of risk profiles, or is there an archetype that you are really trying to hammer? You want as many of those types of guys on your team. One of the keys here to think through is not just value, but what types of players and what mix of players will work for you on the particular Dynasty roster that you have.
The last question, Shawn, for today's show comes in from Ravo, and he's in a Superflex league. What would you be willing to pay for Bo Nix in terms of 2025 picks? So how many picks for Bo Nix? Shawn, it cannot be 7 first-round picks.
No, it's not going to be 7. I do have him as an early round 3 startup value, have him at QB 8. So again, a lot of rankings that you see out there pretty dramatically overvalue QBs and Superflex. And so a lot of those guys are pushed up. You want to keep in mind where the market is versus where the actual value may be. But with Nix at QB 8, that's certainly still in the range where you would expect multiple first-round picks to pry him away. It's a pretty exciting development in that he was in that sort of 203 range a year ago. To go from there to a situation where now you would need multiple first-round picks to pry him off of a roster, that's a huge win for managers. I'm probably still a little more optimistic than the community in terms of what both the floor and the ceiling is. I think the bust risk with Nix now is very, very low, and you have that potential for him to emerge as a passer, not necessarily becoming Drew Brees, but doing a lot of volume in a Sean Payton offense, and then adding in enough rushing that you have this profile that probably never gets to the Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson type of range, but comes in between those guys. Even some of the fun, potentially trendy one-off types of seasons from guys like a Joe Burrow, a Patrick Mahomes. When you think about these elite passers and simply what they have to do, especially in the current environment, in order to put up those point totals, will they hit on individual seasons that do it? Yes. Are they going to consistently do it? I mean, they have a real challenge to hit what Nix can do just by being average. So when you think through that, he's a multiple first-round pick guy. We have gotten close to this draft, so 2025 picks in particular are going to be worth more now. We do have some players in the 2025 draft that even though if you have the pick to use on them, obviously it would just be the one pick, but would already kind of be valued in that multiple first-round pick type of range. But if you move into, say, the second half of round one, you are talking about multiple first-round picks in order to be able to acquire someone like a Bo Nix.
So thanks to everyone who submitted questions for this edition. If you have any questions you would like to hear discussed over the next couple of weeks or months on RotoViz OT, send them my way on Twitter or on Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland. You can email them across as well at rotovizradio@gmail.com. The RotoViz Rookie Guide is now available. You can sign up in the link in the description. You can go to rotoviz.com. The link is on the top left-hand side of the page. Get yourself access to all of the information that Shawn and the team have put together as the combine progresses, and then you will have the other 2 editions to come out as we move forward here through draft season and look forward to your rookie drafts. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined as always by Shawn Siegele, who you can find in the draft guide on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.